Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mall. My name is Eric. Hi, Mike.
Hey there.
How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing well. Just got a run in, feeling pretty energized.
Nice. I have not done that. I haven't done much except have a cup of coffee out of a mug with my face on it today. You got some music for me from this week? You listen to anything interesting?
I have been, I think. I think of the two of us, you are probably the greater jazz aficionado. I don't listen to a lot of recorded jazz, I think partially because I feel like it's probably something better seen live or heard live. But also, I think most of my brain space that I would use for that type of instrumental music is probably taken up on classical music.
Hmm.
But anyway, I always find a couple of jazz albums every year that I really like, and I came across one recently that was on. I saw it on Bandcamp. It's by this. The main artist is this Chicago guy named Mike Reed, and the album is called "The Separatist Party." I guess he collected together a bunch of musicians and performers to make this, but it was supposedly inspired by an essay that was in, I think, the New York Times in 2015 about this. The essay was called "The Lonely Death of George Bell." It was about this hoarder who died alone in his New York apartment, and nobody knew he was dead for like a week.
Wow.
How the music connects to that is a little bit harder to explain, but anyway, it's this interesting combination of jazz and spoken word, and I don't know, it's got a little bit of a groove sometimes. Uh, it's it's unusual, but I really enjoy it. I just keep listening to it over and over again, and kind of repeating things that the spoken word guy says. Like I get this phrase, "Your soul is like a mosh pit," stuck in my head. um, yeah, so that's really been occupying a lot of my listening time recently, and I can't explain why, but I really, really enjoy it. It's probably one of my favorite works of this year.
I'm going to check it out. You mentioned being a classical music nerd again, and I ended up finding a recording of the Goldberg variation called the Open Goldberg Variations. So, in homage to your Bach nerdery and my neophyte status, we're going to use that for our theme music here for this episode.
I look forward to it.
I've been listening to the Boygenius record. It's actually called The Record. I am a huge fan of Phoebe Bridgers, who is one of three musicians who makes up Boygenius. The other being Julian Baker and Lucy
Dacus.
Dacus. I'll just
Yeah.
get her pronunciation wrong. It's a pretty fun album. It's not like I love, but I am enjoying it. It's fun to listen to. There's a couple songs on there that have this real fun '90s indie rock feel, and harmonizations for them are really good. And I always love the lyrics of Phoebe Bridgers. I think she's like the greatest lyricist alive right now.
Yeah, I like her work as well. Actually, I like all three of them a lot, and I kind of enjoy this relationship that they have. It's kind of unique and sort of weirdly heartwarming. I don't know why.
They look like
But
they're having fun. If you look at videos of them.
yeah, they look like they're having fun, and they look like they genuinely, like each other.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have to admit, I kind of half love the album. There's a couple of songs on there that I added to my 2023 favorite list, but there's also a couple on there that I just sound kind of like B-sides to me.
Mm.
I like the album. I don't love it either.
Mm. Did you think about this question I asked you last week about who you'd like to meet, living person?
I did. I started to think about it and write down names when they would occur to me, and I think I ended up with 5 or 6 people on the list, and
You
tried to
took it.
narrow.
You took it a lot more seriously by writing stuff down than I did.
Yeah, it's an interesting intellectual exercise, I guess. Um,
Well, who'd you come up with?
so there were 2 people I narrowed it down to, both of whom are writers, oddly enough. There was only actually one person on my list who was a technologist of any sort. But the two people I whittled it down to were the current poet laureate Ada Limon and the author Kim Stanley Robinson, who's mostly known for his science fiction and what are called climate fiction works.
That's a great pick for you. Kim Stanley Robinson, backpacker. I should have picked that one for you. I should have guessed that one. That's a great pick.
Yeah, I think if you only know him for his writing, you may not know that he's also he's a Californian and lives up near Davis and spends a lot of time in the Sierra Nevadas and hikes around the Sierra Nevadas. And so, and he actually wrote a book about the Sierra Nevadas recently.
Hmm.
So that's, in addition to his fiction work, I like that aspect of his persona and would probably enjoy talking to him about it. Though if pressed, I would probably pick Ada Limon, but
Hmm.
I really enjoy her poetry. And, since I discovered her a couple of years ago, she's become both the poet laureate and a MacArthur Genius Grant winner. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
clearly, I'm not the only person who finds her interesting.
I was thinking about this question because I thought, is there anybody living or dead whose work I have respected, but who I would not want to meet? And a name immediately popped in my head, and that name was Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein. But he just seems like a completely miserable, unfun person to hang out with. And then I thought, you're always giving me a hard time about talking about his work. So this is stuff that just kind of I took a few classes in college and it really had a strong impression on me and now it lives rent free in my brain. So I thought we could talk about it today. I'll try to relate it to programming and then we could get it out of our systems and never talk about it again. If you're up for it. You up for it? What do you think?
I'm up for it. I'm skeptical of the never talking about it again thing, but
You don't trust that second. Never talk about it again. There's a good a great opportunity for me to say something just completely like ignorant in this conversation. I think it's been a long time.
it's your
I'll give it a
turn,
shot.
right?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Normally, I could be the dumb guy and ask the question. So, a little bit about Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, born in Austria in Vienna. I had to look this up. 1889 is when he was born. He died in 1951. There's a book about his life called The Duty of Genius by Ray Monk. So if you're curious about learning more about his life, he was born into a rich, very rich family, Catholic family. He ended up giving away most of his money. He had a large family. I can't remember. He had a number of brothers and sisters, but a bunch of them committed suicide. Three of his brothers committed suicide. They were musical geniuses. They were known as musical geniuses. They were friends with like the Klimts and of Gustav Klimt, his family, the artist, and other rich people in Austria and Vienna. But you read about their family life, and somebody in Ray Monk's book described being around them, the way they interacted with each other, these siblings, as like being at court. They just sound totally miserable and not fun people. Wittgenstein was in the First World War and he was an officer and like everybody hated him. He didn't get along with anybody. He didn't seem to make a lot of friends. And he didn't like modern classical music. This is a guy who's born in 1889. Here's a quote from him. And to be honest, the stuff he's referencing doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I just thought you'd find it interesting. He said, music came to a full stop with Brahms, and even in Brahms, I can begin to hear the noise of machinery.
It's a good line.
No, I guess so. Nothing after that. After Brahms, music died. I don't agree with that.
One story I've heard about Wittgenstein from one of my sons is that when he handed in his dissertation at Cambridge to Bertrand Russell and some other luminary, he said, you're not going to understand this, but don't worry about it. It's not. So sounds like he was somewhat abrasive.
Yeah, that's how people describe him in Ray Monk's book. He spent most of his professional life teaching at Cambridge, and yeah, he worked closely with Bertrand Russell, like you mentioned, and then later on his own. The two books he's most known for are one at the very beginning of his career called the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. It's actually the only book published in his lifetime. And the later book, The Philosophical Investigations, which is actually published after he died. And they're just looking at these two books. The second is it repudiates the first and talks about how the author of the first is confused about things or thinks you can achieve things that can't be achieved. There's other books and papers in between these, but people always talk about like early Wittgenstein and late, and they almost always mean the Tractatus and the Philosophical Investigations. So if anybody says, "Oh, this is you can make a Wittgenstein kind of argument," they may be talking about one or the other. The Tractatus, I have never read all the way through. I have to admit that. And there's this through line of Hilbert to Bertrand Russell to Wittgenstein. And obviously that through line went in other directions, right? You go from Hilbert to Russell to Alan Turing and Alonzo Church, right? There's other directions you can go in. But the background for the Tractatus is Hilbert's plan, Russell's Principia Mathematica, and then Wittgenstein. How do you feel talking about Hilbert's program? Because I don't have a strong background in mathematics.
Yeah, not totally prepared for that, but I think, I guess one of the key ideas there is that he was sort of seeking a mechanical or algorithmic way to solve any mathematical problem. And, as it turned out, people, including Alonzo Church and Turing, proved that you couldn't really do that. There's considerably more to it than that, but that's
that sounds pretty good. But there's also this idea too of like a formal specification or like a set of rules, right? That all math will be founded upon. And you could sort of start with a set of principles and then everything flows from that. We just have to discover those. It was part of Hilbert's program. And so Russell and Whitehead famously wrote the Principia Mathematica. And what they wanted to do was to build up this set of axioms or logical propositions that would then be foundational for all of mathematics and would resolve things like Russell's paradox. The logical propositions were going to build up to sort of a complete structure. Does that make sense? Is that an okay description?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this sort of guiding thing was to eliminate as many assumptions or as many axiom is a tricky word because I think they were trying to get away from stating things as given and trying to get back to first principles on all those things.
That's very good clarification. And so this is how you think about the Tractatus. So the Tractatus is a philosophical work, and it's this set of logical propositions, and it seems to have this goal of if we build our philosophy on a set of rigorously derived, I guess, logical propositions, then we will have a philosophy within which we're able to say true things, right? Accurate things about the world. It starts off famously with this phrase, the world is everything that is the case. And so Wittgenstein read Russell's work and was a student of Russell, and Russell was really excited about Wittgenstein, and he was like, this guy Wittgenstein has learned everything I have to teach, and now he's moved beyond me. So Russell was excited about the Tractatus. And so I think of the Tractatus as this like, we're going to have this structured, formal language we're going to use to do philosophy. And it famously comes to an end in German. He writes, Wovon man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. And that means when we get to something we can't speak about, then we have to schweigen. German has this great word, schweigen. It means to not talk about a thing or to be silent about. In English, it often gets translated as this poetic, we must pass over in silence things that we can't speak about. And just before that, the proposition before that, he writes, my propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them as steps to climb beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. And so this is a useful metaphor, I think. When I read a lot of this stuff in college, it was torturous, weird writing. We would spend a week on one or two of these propositions, and it just got burned into my brain how much you could tangle yourself up trying to unpack what this language is doing. And here's this person saying, well, this is like a ladder, like it's an exercise. You go through the exercise of fighting, struggling against a language, and on the other end, you could throw the ladder away once you've climbed up it. So the Tractatus is ambitious and has a seemingly like idealistic goal. We're going to build up to like a complete philosophy, a philosophy where we can say true things. We're going to do similar to what Russell and Whitehead were doing with mathematics. We're going to ground it in logical propositions. And then Wittgenstein spends, the next 20, 30 years saying, yeah, that's not going to work. It's a total failure. Sorry, I was wrong. It doesn't say sorry, actually. It doesn't say sorry. So then he moves beyond this. And the later book, Philosophical Investigations, as people say later, Wittgenstein, that's the book that I read in college and just kind of burned itself in my brain because it's a weird book. There are these propositions similar to the Tractatus, but they're like he's talking to an interlocutor, and he'll bring up an idea and he'll say, "Is that how language works?" And so when you go from the Tractatus, which is this set of logical propositions, to the Investigations, which is struggling with this question or a number of questions, one of the primary questions in it is, how does meaning happen?
Is that the language games thing?
Right. And yeah, people talk a lot about language games. So he like there's early on in the book, for example, he says, imagine you go into a store and you say to the shopkeeper, I would like 5 red apples. And the Tractatus is, like we're going to build a language. And the Investigations is what's happening. You go into the store, you ask the shopkeeper for 5 red apples. He says, is this how language works? That the shopkeeper goes to a drawer and he looks at the definition of the colors and he sees red. And then he goes to like a mental drawer. And he opens a drawer and he sees the quantity 5 or apples maybe as a concept. And he combines these concepts in his head. If you think about words as just names for things, you could think that we sort of like bashing these concepts together in order to cobble together larger concepts. And Wittgenstein actually, he talks a lot in the Investigations about problems doing philosophy. So he's just like writing this torturous examination of how language works. And in a number of these propositions, he comes to the conclusion that we sort of get deceived. He uses the word bewitched. When we're doing philosophy, when we stop and think about language, we sort of delude ourselves into thinking something is happening that's probably not happening. And he says, if we could be very clear about language, then we could eliminate certain philosophical problems or whole categories of certain philosophical problems. I think the reason why this had such a strong impression on me when I read it, there are two actually. One, here's a person who's sort of self-torturing him, like he's going through this extremely rigorous, difficult examination to try to get to the ground floor of a thing that we use all the time, which is language. Every day we're communicating with each other. And it's an interesting question. Like, how does that happen? What's the magic where I can speak these words and you can understand them? And secondarily, it's a thing we use every day. And people will often say easy, flippant things about language. And they kind of ring this bell in your head like, wait a minute. That may not be how it actually works. So a couple key things come out of the investigations. And there's a lot in there. It's a long book, but one thing that people seize on a lot is this idea of family resemblances. Remember this example. He writes in there, we could talk about what it means to play a game, like a card game or chess or something like that. And you could say, well, maybe game is a concept or a category of things like chess, checkers, cards. These are different kinds of games. Okay, so that word already covers some interesting territory. But here's what makes it weirder. He says you could go to a country you've never been to. You could see people engage in an activity you've never seen, and you could say those people are playing a game. He's really interested in how it's possible for you to identify something you've never seen before and apply the word to it. You know, it's like you don't have a complete collection of examples in your head because if it worked that way, you would never be able to apply the word in the new situation. And so he talks about how when you have meaning in a language, when you're applying words, it's really like you're following the rule for the thing, like a mathematical rule. If I say, tell me the next number in the series, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, you would say 12, and you're following the rule that I've laid out. You don't necessarily need the example in order to apply it to a new thing. So he sort of starts arguing that using words correctly is sort of like following the rules for the words. And then he gets into this really weird discussion, which is, let's say I'm going to come up with a new term. I'm going to try to use it correctly. I'm not going to share it with anybody. And it's going to name some like inner sensation inside my body or my brain or whatever. And he ends up arguing that it would be virtually impossible for me to know that I'm applying the word correctly, that I'm following the rule for the word, because that inner state is amorphous and ambiguous, right? It's like I need to know the situations in which I can apply that thing. And this is often called the private language argument. Can I come up with a language that I don't share with anybody? And the thing that makes this hard to think about is I can't just translate it into our language. It has to be a completely new concept that I'm trying to name in some completely new way. And I have to know that I can apply that name consistently. And he argues you can't. His argument is you can't do that. So you can't have language on your own. And if you can't have language on your own, then language is only a shared thing. It only can happen between people. And if it's a shared thing, then meaning is a shared thing. And using words is really just knowing when to use them in the right situations. Is this making sense? How am I doing?
Um, yeah, it makes sense. It kind of brings to mind a couple of things, which I may be misapplying. But so first of all, it reminds me a little bit of work that Douglas Hofstadter did. He's best known probably for Gödel, Escher, Bach,
Hmm.
and the column he used to write in Scientific American called Metamagical Themis. But he wrote this book. He did research in artificial intelligence, and he wrote this book, I think maybe in the 80s, called Fluid Concepts and Creative Analogies. And as an interesting side note, that is the first book I ever bought on Amazon.
I can't believe you remember that. I don't remember the first book I ever bought on Amazon.
He talks in there about research that some of his students were doing about. So he was kind of disillusioned by the direction that artificial intelligence was taking because he didn't think of it as simply accumulating rules or simply uh, doing what people have tended to call curve fitting in recent years. But so one of his research directions was basically writing programs to discover patterns. And
Hmm.
one approach that he took there was like literally programs where you would input a sequence of numbers and then the program would attempt to find the rule that you were following to find the next number in the sequence. So um, that kind of reminds me of the rule following thing. I don't know how much. I don't know if Hofstadter was inspired by Wittgenstein in that work or not, but um, the other thing it kind of reminds me of, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, is the idea of these embeddings. This idea of taking a phrase or a word or a phrase and sort of putting it in this sort of kind of semantic space, and that that you know it's used in language translation and LLMs and stuff like that. And I sort of
Yeah, I think that's a good connection. Yeah, that's similar to family resemblances thing.
yeah, that's what it reminds me of. I don't know how much of a stretch that analogy is,
No, no,
but
I think that's totally right. I think that's completely right. I think the bewitchment Wittgenstein's interested in is we and philosophers have in the past imagined that there's some sort of pure root concept. If I give you the word chair, that there's some sort of fundamental chairness that informs every possible chair. And Wittgenstein argues, no, probably not. It's interesting that you can apply the word chair to a thing that people are sitting on that looks nothing like any chair you've ever seen before. Does it have to have fundamental chairness for you to use that word on it? No, you're really just using the word, and we're communicating. Like, my response is either going to be you're using the word correctly or you're not using the word correctly. And if enough people are saying you're using the word correctly, you're using the word correctly.
so I think there's an aspect of this that I have trouble with, and I think that you and I may disagree on. Um, I've mentioned a few times that there are certain slang phrases which have morphed in meaning over my lifetime, and probably because I'm a curmudgeon, it bugs me. And
Mm.
you always, respond that it's not. You don't really view it as an issue that language changes, and as long as people get what you're saying, um, it doesn't really matter if the meeting was the same as it was 60 years ago.
It's a feature, not a bug.
um, yeah, I have trouble with that. um, it probably matters, like, we've talked about this out of pocket case. When I was growing up, I'm uh, kind of in between baby boomer generation and Gen X or something like that. But that phrase was clearly meant. The phrase "out of pocket" clearly meant that you were paying for something with your own money, um, and so I'm out of a pocket for that expense. Um, and then around the mid aughts, I started hearing people use it to mean, I'm not going to be available. And I read somewhere that Gen Zers now use it to mean, acting crazy. So,
Hmm.
uh,
Is that a football thing? Is that comes from there's like a pocket that quarterback's in? Is that where it
yeah,
comes from?
that's
Or
that's
we might
that's
not
kind
know.
of my suspicion. Is there's this idea in American football of when the quarterback uh, drops back to pass, he's surrounded by his defenders, and they call that the pocket. And
Hmm.
when he moves out of that space, they call it getting out of the pocket. And in one sense, it means you're sort of not in the space that you're supposed to operate in, but it also means that you're giving up your defender, you're giving up that defensive wall, and so maybe it's a crazy thing to do. I don't know. That is a totally speculative uh, offering. I did not research that at all. So
I don't know it either. Yeah, that doesn't bother me. When phrases change their meaning, when populations change what things mean, and actually language tends to come from the young. New languages is like the youngest people of a population are the incubators of new language. It's like a river. It's just going to keep flowing and going in the direction it wants to go in. And you look at in France where they have the official office, maybe they don't exist anymore, but they're coming up with phrases like courriel électronique. My French accent's terrible because I don't want to import the word email from English. I just see that as it's you're trying to keep your glacier from falling from melting into the ocean as, as you're sailing away on it. People use this shorthand way of referring to Wittgenstein in the investigations as his argument, as they say this phrase, meaning is use. But it does kind of boil down a lot of this stuff about rule following and whether or not you can have a private language. And if you can't have a private language, then language is only a thing that is shared. I'm going to give you a couple quotes that I was sort of stuck in my brain. And there's a lot from the investigations, but he writes that philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. And he also writes about rule following. He uses this in a interlocutor in the investigations. Somebody posing questions to him or he would respond to them. So the interlocutor says, how am I able to obey a rule? And he writes, if this is not a question about causes, then it's about the justification for following the rule in the way I do. If I have exhausted the justifications, I've reached bedrock. And my spade is turned. Then I am inclined to say this is simply what I do. This preposition taken out of context, it seems like he earns stuff in this book. He just bashes himself against this brick wall of these language concepts. And by the time you get here, you're inclined to sort of feel like, yeah, I guess this is just what we do. We do just follow these rules. How does that happen? How does meaning happen? And finally, what is your aim in philosophy? And he says to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. There are all these, there are a lot of like quotes like that in the book. So I guess I need to sort of figure out if this relates to what we talk about mostly, which is software. Does it relate? I will give it a shot. So yeah, this stuff kind of lives rent free in my brain because it was loaded onto me at an impressionable young age. And I find that it relates to everything. This question, where does meaning come from? So it's a big question. And it shows up in the 20th century a lot. It shows up, in other philosophers' work. It shows up in the sciences, I think. I think there's a way in which you can, maybe this is superficial, but there's a way in which you can look at the revolution that comes about in quantum mechanics and argue that they're kind of destabilizing or shaking meaning that existed that we still sort of ignore in a way.
Yeah, relativity too, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you're right. I think this question, where does meaning come from, is one of the most interesting questions we can ask. Is this knowledge valuable for everyone else? I'm not sure. I would say, oh, you need to read this book. I couldn't read it now, I don't think. The process definitely jibes with me. My philosophy is like a ladder, you climb it and throw it away thing really was meaningful to me. I guess I have 3 arguments why these ideas may be connected to the stuff that we work with regularly. So I'll give you those 3. The first is as software engineers, we work in language, right? Our code is expressed in language. It's not natural language, but it is a kind of language. We name variables, we name functions, we name things a lot. And sometimes I'll spend a day going back and forth with people just about what the names for things should be, abstractions, concepts. And that exercise actually, I think, is extremely valuable in reducing bugs. This gets to Donald Knuth's, codes meant primarily to be read and secondarily to run. It's important to be able to reason about, to make sure that it's readable, but also to know that it does what we want. So there's this like rigorous thinking we can apply when we try to produce something that is completely prosaic. And you could think about this family resemblances thing to see how these words should live in our code. I guess there's a harder point that I'm struggling to make here, which is that there's like this boundary between our code and the real world, and that going from one side to the other is a kind of magical transition. I don't think you need Wittgenstein to have good variable names, but I think this exercise of like rigorously trying to communicate logical propositions and rigorously thinking about language is a really good exercise for programmers.
So part of what uh, inspired this conversation, I think, was Dijkstra's essay on called "On the Foolishness of Natural Language Programming."
Yeah, that's the second thing I want to talk about. So the first thing here is thinking very strictly to the greatest degree we can about language. When we use words, we sometimes believe the definition of those words is fixed. And Wittgenstein helps not have such a like rigid, strict belief that the meaning of a word is fixed. The meaning is based on how it gets used. But secondarily, there's this 1978 essay from Dijkstra. Do you want to talk about it, Mike?
Sure. So, Dijkstra was brilliant, but also famously opinionated. And so he wrote this essay. Yeah, I guess there was a movement at the time in the 1970s to sort of try to make programming simpler by doing it at the natural language level. And I think his essay was a reaction to that. It's kind of hard to put in context now, 40 years later, but um, his argument is basically that it would be ridiculous to try to use natural languages as programming languages because um, it's so easy to produce things which are ambiguous and nonsensical, and um, it'd be much harder and much more error prone to use natural languages as in the same way that we currently think of high level computer languages. Um, I guess that's sort of the gist of it. And he's very strongly he was very strongly uh, in favor of sort of mathematical interpretations of code. So I think
Mm-hmm.
you know given his nature and given that time, he was probably it was probably a pretty convincing argument in 1978.
He talks in that essay about how language is ambiguous. And if you try to use natural language to write programs, you're going to end up with ambiguity and nonsense. But I guess I read this and I wondered if he would have made the same argument to Grace Hopper when she wrote COBOL. COBOL was an attempt to like, let's make an easier programming language. It's closer to how humans actually speak and communicate. Well, I guess when I read this Dijkstra piece, it really sounds like a Wittgenstein of the Tractatus type of argument. It sounds like we will discover a formal, and I'm probably misreading Dijkstra here. I'm sure he knows the limitations, but it sounds like we'll eventually discover this rigorous, complete set of, in the Tractatus, logical propositions, or maybe in Dijkstra's sense, a formal specification for a language which will allow us to express programs without ambiguity. And I think the Wittgenstein of the investigations says, nah, there's a limit to that. You could, sure, achieve some improvements, but the completeness is not going to happen. And further, Dijkstra might actually be discouraging areas of pursuit that can make us write programs that are more. I mean, he's writing this before Java and Python exist, right? Could you use this as an argument to say, don't write Java, don't create those languages, not don't write them, but don't create those languages? Or is that going too far?
I think that's maybe going a little bit too far. Um, I think at the time he was. My interpretation of what he's saying is that natural language is so ambiguous and so idiomatic that mapping some sort of semantics onto that is going to always be consistent. Uh, at the level of programming language is kind of a non-starter.
He also says it's going to be so hard to implement. You're just putting more work on yourself.
Yeah, I mean that if you look at the Java case or the Python case, these are still languages with pretty well specified grammars, and there's a lot of research and theory that goes into the semantics of programming languages, and um, with the possible exception of JavaScript. Typically, when you write code, it does what you expect it to. Um, I'm not sure anymore if Dijkstra's argument is completely uh, completely right. But it does seem to me like even in this age where we have things like LLMs that can interpret natural language, it still seems like there's probably a two-step process where we go from the natural language to some more formalized language, and then from that language to like real operational semantics.
Yeah, I guess I'm probably in error in thinking of there's like a spectrum of approaching natural language. And probably my error is that Dijkstra's like, no, no, you're not just going to be able to use natural language. Just it's more of a binary. Like you can't do that. Okay, so as long as you have a formal spec, you're always going to need a formal spec. There was a this this essay that he wrote reminded me of discussions I've seen about static typing. Proponents of static typing are saying you can eliminate certain classes of bugs, and people who don't want to use static types, and I'm in favor of using static types to eliminate certain classes of bugs. I like languages with rigorous, interesting type systems like Rust and Haskell. And there is a fair criticism that comes in response to that fairly regularly, which is sure, you can eliminate certain classes of bugs, but maybe those aren't the most interesting bugs. If I have a application that's going to send a request to another server, I can cleanly encode and very strict type what I get back from that server, but the server might change what it sends me. So there's this layer of translation between what I'm doing and what the rest of the world is doing. Um, and I can never completely encode that formally. And some people say, well, not worth trying. I guess the when I read the Dijkstra piece, I do think, well, is he discouraging us from pursuing things closer to natural language? And is he doing that on the basis of an assumption that we will find a perfect formal specification? And if so, that second thing, and this is a very Wittgenstein influenced gut level response, that second thing's probably not achievable.
I would agree, I think, but I think if you look at even like very simple natural language, like say you have a command like add 2 + 2, um, we know probably what that means, and there's a pretty clear way to make that happen on a computer, whether it's at the machine language level or whether it's some higher level language. But as natural language, there's lots of questions you have to resolve there. First of all, there's 3 words that sound like 2, so to make sure people type them correctly, um, you have to determine if what you mean is the number 2 or the word 2, and if you mean the word
Hmm.
2, what would it mean to add the word 2 to the word 2? So I don't know. I
It'd be tutu.
exactly. Yeah, it's concatenation. So I think this is where the type theory argument comes in is it, the language, even if it doesn't make your software less buggy, it definitely makes you write it in such a way that those questions are answered for you.
Yeah, I guess I think you're probably right. I'm probably misreading Dijkstra a little bit here. I have this doubt in my head that we can't use a set of logical propositions in order to build up a complete correspondence with the meaning of the world that we're really interested in. We need to take meanings from the world in order to operate on them in our code. Otherwise, our code's not interesting. Doesn't do anything that helps us, like. So there's this act of like, I'm taking stuff, I'm trying to represent it in a kind of language. Sure, it's not natural language. So these are the first two things that occur to me that where Wittgenstein's related is number one, rigorously thinking about language and meaning and using that when we write software. Number two is this discussion of that Dijkstra raises, can we have a complete formal specification? Maybe not. We probably don't want to use natural language. Can we use natural language in code? Now, I don't have an answer for that, but I have kind of gut level responses. The third you already raised is the large language models. Because this question comes up all the time. Does a large language model understand the language that it's receiving and producing? And you could make a kind of philosophical investigations argument, which is if it's using the language correctly, then we can say that it's understanding the language. And that might frustrate a lot of people who want to like peer into the inner state of the LLM and say, but it doesn't truly understand. But and maybe this is like a Turing test kind of argument. Maybe it's facile, maybe it's not that helpful. But when you use words, I don't say, oh, Mike understands the word chair because I can peer into his mental state and I could see he's holding the concept in his head while he's using it. It's not at all what happens when you and I communicate. You use the words and I understand them, in which case you're using them correctly in ways that I'm used to, or I don't understand them. And maybe it's my fault, or maybe you're using them in a weird place. It's like you're using the words in conformity with the expectations I have around when those words get used. This is the meaning is use thing. So with this, we could argue that LLMs, quote unquote, understand what they're saying. They're using the words correctly. It's probably not satisfactory to, I don't know, contemporary philosophers or people who studied theory of mind or stuff like that. But there is an argument you could make that this is the best we can say about whether or not they understand the language. Are they using them correctly? And I think these questions come up anytime we talk about meaning.
There's a quote that went around. I think it was originally showed up on what I'm going to call Twitter, regardless of what it's called now. It was something like the hot new programming language is English. So I think there's this idea, at least in the LLM world, that natural languages can be used for programming. There's also a blog post that we came across that talks about using LLMs as sort of a compiler, where you use the somewhat ambiguous natural language to get to sort of an intermediate language, which then has more clear semantics and can be compiled into something that runs on a computer. And there's even this research project at Stanford, I think, called Parcel that's working on doing something like that. So I'm not sure that invalidates Dijkstra's argument or if it bolsters Wittgenstein's argument.
Another way to think about it is, yes, ambiguity exists in language. And then you got to say, well, how does meaning happen? Let's just sort of move forward on that. Like, meaning is happening. We are communicating. We are communicating in spite of whatever ambiguity may exist in the tool that we're using to communicate, this language that we're sharing back and forth. How does that happen? Does it happen in a meaningful enough degree that you could build programs that act on the world similarly? It's possible that we could use natural language in the future to have LLMs write code, and that code could be immediately evaluated in a way where it can be adapted and refined. And it's totally possible we could use natural language to write software in the future.
So what?
And you're right. I don't think that necessarily invalidates Dijkstra. Go ahead.
So what does Wittgenstein say if you use language that is syntactically correct, or even makes sense to a native speaker, but does not effectively communicate an idea to somebody who's hearing it?
I think that's in that following a rule thing. What if we're not following the rule properly? Who decides that you're not following the rule properly? There's this context or group membership aspect to it.
So if the speaker is following one rule and the listener is following a different rule, and communication does not happen, that that still falls within the concepts that he was trying to elucidate.
There's no easy way to say who's right and who's wrong. And the wrong pursuit, philosophical pursuit from his perspective, is to try to peer into their minds and understand if they're really holding the concepts correctly. The right philosophical direction, or his philosophical direction, is to say, what's the game that they're playing, the context that they're in, that will determine who's right. Maybe they're both wrong. I mean, obviously miscommunication happens,
Yeah, this
but there's no
this
like objective reality to it.
this question kind of interests me because it does seem like there's a parallel here to LLMs where sometimes you ask it something or tell it something and it does something different than what you expected, and then you provide it with some context and it is able to produce something more along the lines of what you intended. And
Hmm.
um, I wonder if this is, if this idea of fine tuning or adding context is sort of like analogous to making language more formal.
I guess so. I would sort of lean towards there was a miscommunication that happened, and maybe it's relating to ambiguity, and so you reduce the ambiguity and you reduce the chance of miscommunication.
Okay, and you don't think that's a formalization process in and of itself?
I think a similar question you could ask without LLMs is to say, if you come to me and you say, "Hey, I've got a program I'd like you to write. I've got this spreadsheet and it's got these columns in it, and I write a program and I take your spreadsheet and I compute whatever you wanted, and I bring it back to you and you go, oh no, no, this is all wrong. There would never be negative numbers in here." Well, somehow there's a miscommunication that's happened. I've tried to render the meaning that you assert it exists in association with this spreadsheet. I have incorrectly rendered it. I mean, it's if you had if I were a robot and you didn't know, and I had an LLM powering my brain, you wouldn't know that. It doesn't matter in a way. You would try to refine. You'd be like, Eric, can you fix this? This shouldn't be negative. I think you misunderstood what this column means. It means this. And that meaning part is this subtle thing that happens all the time in our software where we take meanings in the world, we try to encode them in software, operate on them, and then produce outputs that then are meaningful again back in that world. That's probably unsatisfactory.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like what we actually do, or it sounds like sort of the principle behind some of the iterative approaches that have come up in software over the last couple of decades. But I'm trying to figure out if that's if doing that sort of iterative thing of refining the meaning of the original idea is in complete contrast to trying to develop a formal method that specifies things more precisely to begin with.
Yeah, I don't know, actually. That's a fair question. I guess it still rhymes in my head with this argument about static typing. The argument that you will never be able to completely encode everything into types. And some people say, well, give up. And I don't say that. Well, there's still some things I'd like to be able to encode in types.
Well, I think in the example you give, if I forget exactly what you said, but if the person doing the encoding didn't realize that there could be negative numbers, then um, that seems like a failure of type specification.
Maybe. Yeah. I could encode that as a type. This is never going to be a negative. It's a non negative integer always. Um, yeah, maybe. But I still need my program to produce that output. And in order to produce that output, I need to know in advance that this context, that this meaning sort of determines what's supposed to happen. Go ahead.
Do you think Wittgenstein would have been a Python programmer?
I think he would have been a software engineer. I see him more as a C and assembly person. No, he probably actually, I see if he were alive and today, he probably would be a type theory Haskell person. So here's the word of the day for you: Schweigen. I think it's a great word for you to hold because you schweigen all the time. You pass over stuff in silence all the time.
Yeah, it's possible that I guess since most of the people who listen to our podcast are people who know us personally, they are aware of that already. But if there's anybody out there listening to this who doesn't know me personally, uh, it's probably weird that somebody who doesn't talk for days on ends does a podcast. So
All right, Mike, what do you think? We can now move on from Wittgenstein. I don't know how we did, but maybe we can leave this stuff behind. There is one final thing I would say, which is after reading this stuff in college and thinking about it for 20 years, I feel like my ability to say very concrete things about language is diminished. I have low confidence. I sort of could say, yeah, we're communicating. How does meaning happen? I don't know.
I fear this is one of those discussions that has probably brought up more questions than answers. So um, I think it's probably going to have the opposite effect, which is instead of you no longer making Wittgenstein references in the future, we're probably both going to be making Wittgenstein references in the
That's
future.
not my intention. That sounds like the wrong outcome. All right, we should close then. Okay, this has been Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. Thanks, Mike. Nice hanging out with you as always.
You too. See you next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.